now that we have learned about Redux middleware and Redux Thunk, in this exercise, let's employ Redux middleware, a logger middleware, and see how we can log all the changes that we cause to the Redux store into our console. And also, we will use the Redux Thunk to return a function and then see how we can make use of it to carry out actions. To get started on this exercise, let's first install Redux Thunk and Redux Logger into our project. So at the prompt, type yarn add Redux Thunk at 2.2.0. You can also do npm install, as I have always been mentioning. And then let's install Redux Logger at 3.0.6. Now, once we have installed both the Thunk and Logger, let's now go and update our application to apply these two middleware. Going to our project, in the configure store.js file, we will apply the middleware, the Thunk and the Logger. So open the configure store.js file and then import apply middleware from Redux, and also import Thunk from Redux Thunk and Logger from Redux Logger. Now that we have these two middleware available to us, let's apply these two to our store. So to do that, we'll go into the create store here. The create store takes an enhancer as the second parameter here. So since the apply middleware will return a store enhancer, so we'll say apply middleware there and then say Thunk Logger. So both of these are being supplied into our store as enhancers for our store. And once we do that, then both the Thunk and the Logger become available within our application. Now, we will introduce a few additional action types into our application. Now here, I will demonstrate the use of a Redux Thunk by showing you an example without requiring an asynchronous API call. But then after the next lesson, we'll come back to introduce communication with a server, where I will again modify this Thunk to allow us to communicate with a server. Now, before we do that, let's go to action types. In action types.js, let me add in a few more action types. I'll say export dishes loading as dishes loading and dishes failed as dishes failed, and then add dishes as add dishes. Now, from the names itself, you sort of can begin to guess what the intention of these action types are. The dishes loading means that the dishes are currently being fetched, perhaps from a server. The dishes information is being fetched from a server. The dishes failed means that you failed to fetch the dishes information from a server. And then add dishes means that you want to add the dishes into your store. So that's the intention of these three actions here. So once we have introduced these action types, let's open actioncreators.js, and then in here we will introduce the first Thunk into place here. Now, in here, what I'm going to do is I'm also going to open the dishes.js file, and I'm going to remove this from the dishes.js file. We will no longer need it there because I'll make this the responsibility of the action creator to supply that information to my dishes reducer. So I'm going to put it into place here. So I've cut this from dishes.js and then moved it into the action creator.js file here. Now let me introduce more functions here. So we'll say export const fetch dishes. And as you would expect, the fetch dishes should be used for fetching the dishes from wherever you're supposed to. Now we're going to create this as a thunk. So that's why it is going to return a function. So that's the reason why I define that as an arrow function there. And inside that, there will be another arrow function. So you see that this is returning a function from here, a function in here. So this is the function that is going to be returned. This is creating this particular function here, and this function is going to be returned by this. And this function, as you see, the inner function gets access to the dispatch and also get state if you require. But right now in this example, I'm only going to make use of the dispatch. And so we will define the inner function in here. So you can see that this is going to be a thunk here because it is returning a function which is containing an inner function in here. So what does this do? So first it says dispatch dishes loading with true here. Now what does that mean? We'll come to that point in a short while. And then after that, I'm going to introduce a short delay. I'm just going to take the help of the set timeout function here to introduce that delay there. Later on, we will replace this with an asynchronous call to a server there. So the set timeout is going to supply a function with a delay of 2000 milliseconds. So that's what it is going to cost. Now, inside the set timeout, what am I going to do? I'm going to, after a 2000-second delay, I will dispatch a call to another function called add dishes with the dishes that I have imported here. So this dishes object will be supplied to the add dishes here. So as you can see, this thunk is doing two dispatches. First, it does the first dispatch. We'll see what this dishes loading is going to do in a short while. And then after 2 seconds delay, it's going to dispatch the add dishes. So this is going to push the dishes into the state of our store there. Now, let me implement the next function, which is dishes loading. What does dishes loading do? So this is a function which returns, as you would expect, an action here. What kind of an action is it going to return? It's going to return an action of the type action types dishes loading. That's the action that it is going to return. Now note that in this case it doesn't have any more data associated with it. It is going to only return a type here. Now based upon how we implement the dishes reducer, that will be able to interpret what this action is going to do. Now intuitively you might have already guessed that this is going to inform somebody saying that the dishes are beginning to be loaded, and so you need to wait for the dishes to be loaded. So that's the interpretation that we're going to give to this function here. Now again, also I will implement another function called dishes failed. And this dishes failed will take an error message as a parameter. So this is again a function as you expect, which is going to return an action object. So it'll return an action object of the type action types dishes failed, and also it'll return a payload as error message. Now in this case, this error message is going to be a string, but the implementation here doesn't really tell you what the error message is. Whatever we pass into the dishes failed object, that will be delivered as a payload to the dishes reducer, and so we will make use of it there. Now when you fix the reducer, then you'll begin to see how we're going to be interpreting all these different things there. Now so dishes failed, and then also you have this add dishes that I need to implement. So how do I add dishes? So that will also be a function that returns an action. And what kind of an action? You have already guessed that by now. Note that the add dishes is taking the dishes, all the dish information as a parameter here. So it must be creating an action of the type dishes, add dishes action type, and then it'll pass the dishes as the payload, or the second part of my action object here. That's it. So we have now set up all the action creators here, 4 different action creator functions here. 3 of them are returning an action object, the dishes loading, dishes failed, and add dishes. And then the 4th one, the fetch dishes, is a thunk that is returning a function that is going to call or dispatch several actions. Now that we have fixed up the action types, we need to interpret these 3 different action types. And as you would expect, these 3 different action types are going to affect only the dishes part of the state of our application. So the action should all be in the dishes.js file. So going into the dishes.js file, let me import the action types here. So I'm going to copy this action types from the action creators and then import that into the dishes here. Now, since we already have the switch statement, so I should be able to now switch between the 3 different action types that I'm going to receive here. So let me set up the 3 action types here. So we'll say case action types add dishes. So that is one of them. Then we'll have a case action types, then dishes loading, and also a case for action types dishes failed. So 3 different actions need to be interpreted by this reducer function here. So it's supposed to do something in response to receiving these 3 actions. So it's the responsibility of this dishes reducer to interpret what these actions mean. Now, when we come in here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the shape of my state here. My state will no longer be just dishes here. The dishes is not available anywhere here. So I'm going to change the state to have 3 different parameters here. So I'm going to rewrite this as follows. So this state here will have 3 different parameters. So it'll say is loading, which will be initially set to true, and then a second parameter called error message, which will be initially set to null, and then a third parameter dishes, which will be initially set equal to an empty array. So now you see that my state has been extended to contain three properties here: the isLoading property, the error message property, and the dishes property. Now, how do we interpret this? Initially, the isLoading property is true because the dishes is empty here. So that means that you need to load the dishes information from somewhere before the dishes, details of the dishes become available within your state. And the error message, it will be set equal to the error message that will be passed in when you receive the dishes failed action here. Otherwise, it will be null. So if you try to fetch the dishes from a server and the server fails to deliver the dishes to you, then you will set the error message to the corresponding error message that has been returned to you from the server. Otherwise, the dishes, if the dishes are obtained correctly, then the dishes will be loaded in with the information about the dishes. Now, that will be done when you receive the add dishes action here. So now you see the three kinds of actions that we have seen here: dishes loading, dishes failed, and then add dishes. Now, what do we do in each of these three cases? Initially, because we don't have the dishes information, I'm going to set the isLoading to true. But then the moment you call the add dishes, then isLoading should be set equal to false because the dishes will be loaded in. And when you call the dishes loading, if it was originally false, it will be set to true, meaning that you are beginning to fetch new dishes. So this way, whenever you go to the server to fetch the dish information from the server, you can set the isLoading to true. Once you obtain the dishes information from the server, you'll set the isLoading to false and then load in the dishes into the dishes property of this part of the state. So now you see that your state shape has changed a little bit, and within the state I am tracking three pieces of information within the part of the state that corresponds to the dishes. So that's the change that we have done here. Now, let me start with the dishes loading. So when you receive an action saying dishes loading, an action of the type dishes loading, what do? You will return. Now, this is where I'm going to use the spread operator from ES6. So that means that this states that whatever the state is, I'm just going to take the same state and then I can add in. So this is the spread operator that I'm going to load in here. So it'll take the current value of the state, and then whatever else that I pass in after this will be applied as modifications to the state. So again, the state itself will not be mutated. Instead, I take the state, I create a new object from the original state and then make some changes to that object and then return that object. So that's why I am returning an immutable from here. So the state itself is not going to be mutated here. So if I receive the dishes loading action, then that means that I'm beginning to load the dishes. So at this point, I'm going to set the isLoading to true, and then the error message will be left as null, and the dishes also will be null at this point. Now, you might say, why would we need to do these two? Maybe in between, you are refreshing the information from the server. So at that point, you will want to do it this way. You set the isLoading to true, and the remaining two you will set to null and the dishes to an empty object here. And that is what you're going to be returning when you receive a dishes loading action type. Now, look at the structure of how I am organizing the reducer here for the dishes part of the state. You will do a similar thing for both the promotions, the leaders, and the comments also when you require to do that. Now, if the dishes fail to load, what do you need to do? Now, as you realize, if the dishes fail to load, then the payload in the call, the action.payload will contain the error message. So in that case, I am going to return the original state with the spread operator. I will set the isLoading to false because I have already failed to load the dishes. So I need to set up the error message. So the error message will be equal to action.payload. and then I will set the dishes to an empty array anyway, because I don't have any dishes here. So by doing this, what we are specifying is that the dishes have tried to be loaded, but it failed. So, and this is the corresponding error message that I've received. So that is what I'm going to be setting in the error message. Now, by doing this, when your state is set up like that, when your React component retrieves this state, it can then interpret this information accordingly and then display this information in the view as per what the state contains. Again, we will modify the view in a short while, and then you will see how we make use of this. Now, the third case, if I am actually returned the dishes object, what am I supposed to do? Now, here, let me just copy this here because the structure would be similar here. So when the add dishes action is called, then in that case, I'm going to take the original state. I'm going to set the is loading to false. The error message will be set equal to null, but recall that the action.payload carries the dishes information. So in this case, I will set the dishes to action.payload. So that's the change that I'm going to make here. So when the add dishes action is passed into this reducer, then whatever is passed in as the parameter there in the payload of the action object, that will be set equal to the dishes there. So now again, going back to the action creator, you see when you create the action here, for the add dishes type, your payload is carrying the dishes there. So that's what is retrieved in the dishes reducer here, and then the dishes property is set equal to that thing. So with this, we have updated the dishes.js file here. And so we have updated the reducer corresponding to the dishes state. Now, how do we make use of this state in our React application itself? So far, we have been only tinkering with the Redux part of our application. Now we will go into the React part of our application and then see how we can make use of this. Now, first and foremost, if the is loading is set to true, I may just want to display a loading spinner on the screen just to keep the user informed about the fact that something is being loaded from somewhere. So to do that, I'm going to create a new component in my application called as the loading component. Now this loading component, I'm going to make use of it wherever I require this. Now, so I will create the loading component by importing React from React, and then I will create this as a, from the structure itself, you should have guessed that this is a functional component that I am creating. So this is going to return this arrow function here. So what am I returning in this arrow function? Very simple. We'll return a loading spinner information here. How do you create a loading spinner here? So we'll say div class name call 12, and inside this div I'm going to use the font awesome, which provides a spinner icon, FA spinner icon, and then if I apply the pulse font awesome class to that, then that will make the spinner rotate around. That's the intention of this. And then FA3x, 3 times the speed, and then we'll say FA forward spinning, and then text primary. So the color of this spinner is going to be primary color, and then close the span. So this will create a rotating spinner on the screen. Now, when we actually make use of this, then you will see what the spinner looks like and how it rotates around. And also, in addition to this, I'm going to display a small message saying loading. I'm sure you have seen these kind of loading messages on many websites or many mobile applications earlier. So that's the loading component which displays this loading message on the screen, which I have just created. So now that we have created, how do we make use of this loading component? So to do that, we need to go into our main component. So going into the main component. Now, let me again go back to the action creators and then draw your attention to this fetch dishes. The fetch dishes, as you see, is a thunk, which returns a function which, when called, will try to fetch the dishes first by setting the isLoading to true, and so that the spinner can be displayed. And after a period of time, the dishes are fetched and then added into the application. So that is what this fetch dishes is going to show for us. So how do we make use of this in the main component? So going into the main component, in addition to the add comment, I'm going to also add in the fetch dishes from the Redux action creators. Now, the fetch dishes, I will map it into my props here. So in the map dispatch to props, I'm going to create a new property called as fetch dishes, which when invoked will result in a call to dispatch fetch dishes function that I have just imported here. So what is this doing? Recall, this is a thunk. And so we can dispatch that thunk by using dispatch. And in order to do the dispatch, I need to map it in the dispatch to props so that this fetch dishes becomes available for my main component to make use of. So in the main component, I need to fetch the dishes. So where do I fetch the dishes? So this is where I can take the help of the lifecycle method of my component called as component did mount. Now this lifecycle method, whatever we include in this lifecycle method, component will mount, will be called or will be executed just after this component gets mounted into the view of my application. So right at that point, this will be called. That is a very good time for me to fetch any data that I require for my application. So that is exactly where I'm going to call the fetch dishes that I just mapped in here, this fetch dishes. So I'm going to call it in there. So what will happen is that when the main component is being mounted into my view by my React application, at that point, after it gets mounted, the fetch dishes will be called, and this will result in a call to fetch the dishes and then load it into my Redux store at that point. And then when that becomes available, then it will become available for my application here. So that's the process by which I'm going to make this available to my application. So you see how much of dependency that goes into this. Now, coming down to the home page here, in the home page, now the dish information itself will no longer be at this props.dishes. Now, if you recall, the dishes, the state.dishes is mapped to dishes, but the state.dishes, the shape of this dishes object has changed, because when you go into the dishes reducer, the dishes object itself is now containing three properties here: isLoading, error message, and dishes. So if you need to get information about all the dishes, then that will be available in dishes.dishes in here. And then similarly, dishes.isLoading, if it is true, that means that the information is being loaded here. So that's something that we need to recognize at this point. So when you pass in the dish information to the home component, we will say this props dot dishes. Okay, so that is what we are going to be using to get access to the dishes, and from there you will fetch and then map the first one and then pass that into my home component. Not only that, you need to remember that there is one more flag or property that I need to pass in, called as dishes loading. So one more attribute that I'm going to pass in called dishes loading, and I'm going to make use of this in my home component. So we'll say dishes loading, and then this would say this props dishes is loading. So that is what will be passed in as the second property here. And then also we need to recognize that it is possible that the dishes fetching may fail, and so the error message may be set there. So I will also pass in error message from the dishes. Now the reason I'm marking these separately as dishes loading and dishes error message is that the same thing will also apply for promotion and leader also later on. So that's why I'm separating them out into 3 different things here. Okay, so for the home, that is what I'm going to pass in. Similarly, for the dish detail here, I'm going to pass in this props dot dishes. The is loading and error message also have to be passed into the dish detail component. So I'm going to come into the dish detail component also and modify this. Now for the dish detail component, since I'm only going to be passing in the dish and nothing else, I can simply call this as is loading and then simply call this as error message. That's perfectly acceptable here. Dish is loading and error message here. So that's how I'm passing in this information into the dishes loading. Now, within my dishes loading or within my dish detail component, so this will result in a modification to the dish detail component. So when I come into the dish detail component, I realize that in the dish detail component, it's possible that when I come in, the props.dish may be null, and so I may not be able to display the dish at all. So in that case, what am I supposed to do? So that is why when you come in here into the dish detail component, we will say here, we will import the loading component from the loading component here, because we're going to be making use of the loading component in here. So in the dish detail component, what I am going to do is we will start out by saying if props is loading, if props is loading, if that is true. So you see the order in which I am examining. If the is loading property, recall how we pass in the is loading from the main component. So in the main component, we are setting the is loading to the flag from props dishes is loading. So in the dish detail component, we are saying if props is loading, then we will return. So you see that we are doing conditional rendering here, conditioned on certain properties here. So this here will say div class name container, and inside this div, what I'm going to do is div class name row, remember we need to do this container row and all the business for this also, because you need to properly position that on the screen using the Bootstrap grid. And then we will say the loading component. We just imported the loading component here. So if the is loading is true, then I'm going to just simply return the view as the loading component. So the loading spinner will be shown on the screen. Now, the second part will say else if props error message. So if it is an error message that is going to be shown here, then what do I return? So if it is an error message, then I will return, then we copy this and then modify that here. I'll return container row, and then in here I will say, will not display the loading message. Instead, I'll say h4 props.errormess. So I'm just going to display the error message there. That's about it. Otherwise, of course, the last else says that my dish is not null. The error message is null and the loading is false. Then I drop into which means my dish is ready. So I should be able to display the dish here. So the rest of the code will remain as such. I'll be able to display the dish here. That's the modification that I'm going to make in my dish detail component. Look at the structure of this code. The same structure I will be making use in many other places where I display the details about the dish here. Now, the dish information is displayed in 3 different components: the dish detail component, the menu component, and the home component. So 3 different places where I will have access to the dish detail component. So, or rather where I will have to rely on the information about the dishes. So the next thing that I'm going to fix is the home component. So going into the home component, in the home component, now I'm going to fix up this render card by saying item is loading error message. So 3 things that I will display here. So here I will say item is loading error message for the dishes. So recall that we had props.dish, which is being supplied here. The 2 other things that came in as parameters here, so that I will pass in as the error message. So I'll say is loading equal to props dot dishes loading. Recall that from my main component, I'm passing in dishes loading and dishes error message here. So these 2 also need to be passed into my render card component there. So I'll say is loading. So for the sake of clarity of reading, I will put that into the next line here. And then the next one says error message is props dot dishes error mess. Did I say dishes error mess? Yes, I said dishes error mess here. So I will say dishes error mess. So that's it. So I'm passing in these 2 also as parameters here. For the remaining 2, we'll fix that up later when we have those also operating using the same approach that I used for dishes. I'm demonstrating to you how we do it for dishes, but the other ones I will probably leave that as an exercise for you in one of the later exercises or in the assignment. So we'll look at those later. Now, within the card, when you display the card, you realize that now you are going to be receiving 3. Item is loading an error message. So in here, we're going to be fixing up this by saying in the render card, we'll say if is loading, we will return loading from here. Now, if I need to return loading, I need to import loading from loading component. Right? Now, so if is loading, else if error message. So this would be a generic structure that we will do here. Else error message. If error message, return. Now in this case, the row and column and the other part is already taken care of by my home components layout. So that's why I don't need to surround these with the divs with the container and row here. So I can just simply pass these directly here. So if the error message is not null, then I will pass the error message in here. Otherwise, I will return this part here. Let me indent this here. So I will return else. So the else part will cause me to return the layout of the card as such. So that's how we'll fix up the home component. The last one left to fix is the menu component. Going to the menu component. In the menu component, when I come in here, I will be receiving so going to the main component, let's see how the information about the dish is being passed into the menu component. So going into the home component, for the menu component, you see that I'm saying dishes is this props dishes. So the entire dishes object is being passed in there. So I will have dishes is loading dishes.dishes, dishes.error message, all three available to me here. So in the menu component, I need to fix up the way I render the menu component here. So how do I fix that up? So in here, we'll say const. So again, first thing first, I need to import the loading component from the loading component. That's the first thing that I need to do. And then here, when I render the menu, this would be props.dishes.dishes, not props.dishes. So I need to update that. And then here, I will change this to saying if props.dishes.is loading. So if the dishes is being loaded, then I need to return the loading. So let me go to the dish detail component and then simply copy this part here, because that would be useful for me as a way of saving myself the trouble of having to type the whole thing there. So let me paste the code in here and then we'll fix this up. So if the props.dishes.is loading is true, then I will return the loading. If props.dishes.error message is true, then I will return props.dishes.error message. So remember to fix the code correctly when you copy also. So that's very important. Otherwise, you will end up with a problem in the way your application is running, and you'll be chasing around trying to figure out where the thing has gone wrong. If none of these are true, then I will return the layout as I show here below. So let me just indent this for ease of reading. So otherwise, I will return the actual layout of my menu as shown here. That's it. So we have fixed up all the components to enable us to take care of the fact that the dish loading will take some time. Now, let's save the changes and then go and take a look at our application in the browser. Going to the browser, well, it seems that my application has already gotten loaded. Let me just try to refresh this, and then you will see how this works. So when I refresh it, you will initially see the loading on the dishes before the actual dish information is loaded onto the screen here. So that is what the loading component is doing there. Similarly, if I go to the menu component, because the dishes have been fetched already, so the menu component will render without any problem. But suppose I refresh my application, you will see the loading being displayed there before the actual menu items are displayed there. Similarly, let me go to a specific dish, and then again I'll reload my application. So when I reload my application, you will see the loading spinner being shown initially before the information about the dishes are shown on the screen there. Now, once the dish information is fetched, then my application will display the information just like before, so there will be no change there. Now, the other part that I haven't discussed is the middleware, the logger middleware that we have put into our application. How does the logger middleware work? Now, to see the logger middleware's operation in your browser, open your JavaScript console of your browser. If you are using Chrome, that's where you find the JavaScript console. If you are using another browser, look for it in the developer tools. Now, going into the again, I'm extending this so that you can see what has been printed in the console here. So in the console, what does the logger do? The logger prints out all the various actions that are dispatched, and also it, as you can see, it shows the previous state, the action, and the next state. So this is a good way of watching out to see if your application is doing exactly what it is expected to do. So as you can see, initially when my application got loaded, I dispatched the dishes loading action there. That this dishes loading action was dispatched by my call to the fetch dishes. And in here, look at the previous state. When I open the previous state, you can see that the comments are there, the leaders are there, the promotions are there. But look at the dishes part of the state there. In the dishes part, is loading is true, error message is null, and the dishes itself is an empty array here. So that's what it shows here. Now, when the dishes loading is called, so this is the action that has been sent, the dishes loading action. When that is called, you can see that there is no change in the state here because that is still is loading is true initially. But then look at the add dishes. When the add dishes is called, the previous state is loading true and so on. But then what does the action carry? The action itself carries the add dishes type, and the payload here carries the information about all the 4 dishes. We have just passed this information in through the action, and then your store will update the dishes array. So you see that the dishes part of the state has now been updated. Note that the is loading is false now because the dishes now is an array of 4 objects. As you see, we have 4 dishes in our application, so the 4 dishes have been loaded. You can open this and then see the 4 dishes in here. This was exactly what was passed in as the payload for my object here. So that is your Redux Thunk and your Redux Logger in action. So as I said, the Redux Logger will enable you to trace your application as it is executing things. So as the different actions are being dispatched to your Redux store, all that will be logged in the console here. So that is, if your application is not doing what you expect it to do, this is a place where you can debug to see if the state changes are happening correctly or not. So that's the use of the logger that we have seen earlier. So with this long exercise, we have completed integrating the Redux Thunk and the Redux Logger into our application. We have created our first Thunk, and then we have seen how we can set up our application to be able to quote unquote asynchronously load in information into our Redux store through the Thunk. And how we can display a loading message on the screen while this loading is happening. This is a good time for you to do a git commit with the message Redux Thunk.